Today I'm going to cover both the day 1 and day 2 video for interval notation. We have been using inequalities to write things like domain and range, and now I'm going to show you how to use interval notation to do the same thing. So going first back to what we know how to use inequalities. So looking at this number line, if I want to use an inequality to represent all the numbers shown here, I would start with the -3, the smallest number. It's inclusive, so I'm going to put less than or equal to x. And then the other end, it has all the numbers in between, all the way up to 5. But 5 is not equal to, so I'm just going to put the less than symbol and put the 5 there. Okay. Same with number 2. If I do the inequality for number 2, I'm going to start at +2, but it is just an open circle, so less than x, and then it's everything greater than that, so less than infinity. The other way that we've written that same domain like that is saying that really we're saying it's all the numbers of x that are greater than 2. So you could also write x is just greater than 2. You could write it either way. Okay, on the third one, I've actually changed this problem from what you see in your notes just because we want you to see something that has two different pieces. So as an inequality, we would say this is x, all the values of x that are smaller, less than, or equal to -1. So x is less than or equal to -1. Or it's all the values of x that are greater than 4, x greater than 4. And it's that entire piece there that is the inequality. Now another way to represent that is to say this graph is going from -infinity, which is less than x, which is less than or equal to -1, or x is starting at +4, which is less than x, which is less than infinity. So that's another way to represent that same, using inequalities. So now let's go ahead and change these now into a new notation called interval notation. So for interval notation, it omits the inequalities and it omits the variables and it just uses these symbols here, brackets or parentheses. If the value is inclusive, we're going to use a bracket. If the value is not inclusive, it's an open circle, or if it's infinity, we're going to use a parenthesis. So for this first one here, again, we have the -3 and the 5. Those are the ends, -3, 5 now. The -3 is inclusive because it has an open circle, or excuse me, a closed circle. So we use a bracket there. And then the 5 is not inclusive, so it uses the parenthesis. And that's all we have to write for the interval notation. Number 2, one of the reasons why we've gotten you into the habit of using this with the infinities in here is to help you prepare for interval notation. For interval notation, we start at the 2, but it's not inclusive, so we're going to put a parenthesis. And this graph goes on towards infinity, which also gets a parenthesis. And that's how we write the interval notation for number 2. Now, in number 3, there are two pieces to it. So the way I wrote this in pink down here, we're going to have all these infinities and negative infinities. So we have -infinity all the way to -1. The infinity gets a parenthesis. The -1 is a closed circle, so it gets a bracket. Then we're going to put a U for union. That's going to connect it with a second set starting at 4, but not inclusive, so it gets a parenthesis. Then we put a comma, and then we're going towards infinity on the other end. And so that's the full way to write that domain using interval notation. So let's extend that out to graphs that have both x and y. So in example number 4, we have domain. Remember, domain is always going to go from left to right. So the leftmost point here on the x-axis is -6. And because it's an open circle, it's going to get a parenthesis. And then it goes all the way to the other end of x, which is +7. But because that's a closed circle, it gets a bracket. The range now is going to go from the bottom to the top. So the bottom all the way down here is -4. Now, because we have an open circle, most of you would say, okay, the -4 gets a parenthesis. The problem that we see, though, is that we have this horizontal line, and there's lots of point values that have a y value of -4 all the way down this line here. So those are priority over that open circle. So we do have to make this an inclusive -4 because of that horizontal line. Then we go all the way to the top up here, and the top 1, 2, 3, 4 is +4. And again, because of the closed circle, we're going to go ahead and put a bracket on that. Okay, let's try the next one. So we have two sections of a graph. So for our domain, we start all the way to the far left, which is -5, comma, and then this continues until 0. Both of those are going to get brackets because they have inclusive values at -5 and 0. But there's a second section, so we put the U in there. And the second section starts at +2 with a closed circle, so it's inclusive. And then that's an arrow. It's kind of hard to see it, but that is an arrow there, so it is going on to infinity, which is going to be a parenthesis. For the range, it starts down here at the bottom, 1, 2, 3, -3 at the bottom. And that is inclusive. And it goes to the top of that shape that looks like a parabola there, which is at +2, and that would also be inclusive. Again, there's a jump, there's a hole, it kind of skips there. And it starts over again at +3. And then because the arrow's pointing up, it goes to infinity. Okay, notice that there are two sections. They're being connected together. The other thing to notice about this is the domain range. Because there's no variables written in here, it's kind of hard to indicate and know which one we're talking about. So we do need to write the words domain and range or put a D or an R just to help identify those. Okay, and then lastly, number 6. So the domain is starting all the way the left side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, -5. And then it goes on to the end, to the infinity. There we go. And the range starts all the way down here at the bottom, all the way down where that little minimum point is down there at -3. We're going to include the -3. And then even though there's an end point here, that arrow does remind us that it's going up forever, so it's going to infinity. Okay, that concludes interval notation. At this point, we do expect you to be using interval notation all second semester for writing domain and ranges.